I hadn't even moved in yet when I got the call. Someone told me my inherited ranch had been sold. Not listed, not negotiated, sold. The problem was, I never signed anything. A stranger was already claiming ownership. Paperwork was being passed around. And when I tried to step in, the HOA president said it was already handled. She claimed the ranch belonged to the community, claimed she had authority, claimed I was too late. Then she called 911 and told them I was trespassing on my own land. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a power grab, and she had no idea how badly it was about to backfire. The ranch had been in my family longer than I'd been alive. It wasn't flashy, no grand entrance, no luxury buildings, just wide open land, old fencing, a weathered gate, and a house that had seen generations come and go. My grandparents had worked it. My parents had protected it. And when it was finally passed down to me, it came with one simple understanding. This land was ours. When I inherited it, I wasn't in a rush to move. Life was complicated. Work, obligations, timing. I paid the taxes, kept the paperwork updated, and planned to settle in once everything lined up. The ranch stayed quiet in the meantime, just as it always had. What I didn't know was how much the area around it had changed. Developments had crept closer over the years. Subdivisions where fields used to be, gated communities with neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses, all governed by HOAS with boards, rules, and enforcement powers that stopped right at their fences, or at least they were supposed to. Somewhere along the way, the HOA next to my property started treating the ranch like an extension of their neighborhood. They used phrases like adjacent land and community space. They talked about future plans, trails, access points, expansion, none of which involved asking me. I didn't attend HOA meetings. I wasn't on their mailing list. I didn't even live there yet. But my absence seemed to encourage assumptions, and those assumptions slowly hardened into entitlement. The first sign something was wrong came quietly. A neighbor I'd never met called to congratulate me on the sale. He assumed I was the previous owner, said the HOA had told residents the ranch was changing hands and would soon be developed for community use. I laughed at first, then I asked him to explain. What he described didn't sound like a rumor. It sounded like a transaction, a buyer, a closing timeline, even a tentative start date for construction. I pulled out my documents, my inheritance papers, the deed. Everything was exactly as it should have been. That's when the second call came in, this time from a realtor. She asked if I was still the legal owner because her office had already received confirmation of sale, confirmation I had never given. And suddenly, the quiet inheritance I'd taken for granted felt like it was slipping away, without my consent, without my signature, and without me even being there to stop it. At that point, I stopped laughing. I called the realtor back and asked her to slow down. I told her plainly that I hadn't sold anything, that I hadn't signed anything, that the land was inherited and still legally mine. She went quiet for a moment, then told me something that made my stomach drop. She said the paperwork didn't come from me. It came from the HOA. According to what she'd been given, the HOA president had represented herself as an authorized party acting on behalf of the property. She'd claimed the ranch was community-adjacent land that had reverted to HOA control due to non-occupancy. She provided maps, letters, even what looked like official approval documents. None of it was true. I asked the realtor to send me copies of everything. When I opened the files, I felt a mix of anger and disbelief. My property lines had been altered on the maps. My name wasn't forged, but it had been conveniently omitted. Instead, the HOA's name appeared where mine should have been. It was bold, confident, almost reckless. I immediately contacted the county records office. They confirmed what I already knew. The ranch was still in my name. Taxes paid, deed intact, no transfers recorded, no liens, no legal mechanism that would allow an HOA to sell it. But that didn't stop what was already in motion. The buyer hadn't backed out yet. Construction interest had already been discussed. Timelines floated, contractors mentioned. The HOA had gone so far that reversing it quietly was no longer possible. I tried reaching out directly. I called the HOA's listed number and asked to speak to the president. I explained the situation calmly, told her there had been a serious misunderstanding, that the land wasn't HOA property, that it was inherited and legally protected. She didn't apologize. She said the HOA had authority over unused land bordering the community. She said the ranch had been abandoned. She said she'd acted in the neighborhood's best interest, and she told me that if I wanted to contest it, I could take it up later. Later, as if ownership was temporary, as if land could be sold first and sorted out afterward. I told her she had no right to do this, that she was putting herself and the HOA at risk, that what she'd done could have serious legal consequences. Her tone hardened. She said I was being aggressive. She said I was interfering with a lawful process. And then she said something that made everything crystal clear. She said if I showed up on the property before things were resolved, she would consider it trespassing and involve law enforcement. That was the moment the situation crossed from outrageous to dangerous. I hadn't even set foot on my own land yet, and she was already threatening to call the police on me for it. I booked the earliest flight I could. When I arrived, the ranch looked the same as it always had, quiet, open, unchanged. But the feeling was different now. There were fresh survey flags near the fence line, spray paint markings on the dirt, signs that someone had been preparing the land for something new, something that wasn't mine. I stepped through the gate and walked the property, documenting everything: photos, videos, timestamps. I wanted a record of how far this had gone. That's when a car pulled up near the road. Then another. And finally a police cruiser. The HOA president hadn't been bluffing. She'd already made the call. And as the officer stepped out, looking between me and the land beneath my feet, I realized I was about to be accused of trespassing on property that had belonged to my family for generations. The officer didn't start aggressive. He asked basic questions: who I was, why I was on the property, whether I had permission to be there. I told him calmly that I was the owner, that the land had been inherited, that I had the deed, tax records, and county confirmation on my phone and in my bag. Before I could even finish, the HOA president interrupted. She told the officer the ranch had already been sold, that ownership had changed hands, that I was trespassing and trying to interfere with a lawful transaction. She spoke confidently, like someone used to being believed. The officer asked her for proof. She handed him a folder. Inside were copies of the same documents the realtor had sent me: altered maps, HOA letters, a purchase agreement signed by the buyer and countersigned by the HOA president herself, acting as the authorized representative. No signature from me, no power of attorney, no legal standing at all. The officer flipped through the pages slowly. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. He asked her directly how she'd obtained authority to sell land that wasn't HOA property. She said the ranch had been unused. She said the HOA had assumed responsibility. She said the community needed it. Assumed. That word hung in the air. I handed the officer my documents: the deed, the inheritance papers, the tax receipts, a letter from the county confirming no transfer had ever occurred. The officer stepped aside to make a call. This one took longer. While he spoke, another cruiser arrived, then a county sheriff, then unexpectedly, a representative from the title company involved in the sale. Alerted after I'd raised questions earlier that morning, the scene shifted fast. What had started as a simple trespassing complaint turned into a full stop on the transaction. The title company rep reviewed the documents on site and went pale. She said the sale could never have legally closed, that the HOA had no authority, that this was at best a fraudulent representation, and at worst criminal. That's when the HOA president panicked. She raised her voice, accused me of harassment, claimed I was intimidating her. Then she did something that stunned everyone. She called 911, standing 10 feet from two police officers. She told the dispatcher there was a hostile individual trespassing and interfering with a lawful sale. She claimed she feared for her safety. The officers stared at her. One of them gently took the phone from her hand and ended the call. He told her, very clearly, that making false emergency reports was a serious offense, that the land was not HOA property, that the sale was invalid, and that she was no longer in control of this situation. Then he said the words that changed everything. He said the matter was being referred to the county and the district attorney for review. He said the HOA president should not leave the area, and he said she should strongly consider contacting an attorney. The buyer was informed on the spot that the sale was void. The title company froze all activity. County officials documented the altered maps and letters. And just like that, the illusion of authority collapsed. The HOA president didn't yell anymore. She didn't argue. She just stood there staring at the land she'd tried to take, realizing she had no power over it at all. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the narrative. She was part of it. After that moment, everything moved quickly, and yet somehow painfully slow. The officers didn't arrest anyone on the spot. This wasn't television. This was real life, where consequences arrive in paperwork, follow-ups, in quiet conversations that carry more weight than flashing lights ever could. The HOA president was told to leave the property, not as an order barked out loud, but as a firm instruction that left no room for argument. She gathered her papers, hands shaking now, and walked back toward her car without saying a word. The buyer left soon after, confused, upset, angry, but not at me, at the situation, at the HOA, at the fact that they'd nearly invested in land that was never for sale in the first place. Within hours, the title company issued a formal freeze. No further actions, no filings, no transfers. The so-called sale was officially void. But the real aftermath didn't unfold that day. It unfolded over the weeks that followed. County officials launched a review into how the HOA had represented the land. Emails were subpoenaed, maps were examined, statements were taken. What became clear very quickly was that this wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern of assumption. The HOA had slowly convinced itself that land it didn't own could be controlled simply because it bordered their community. That absence meant abandonment. That silence meant consent. None of that holds up under the law. The HOA president resigned before the investigation was finished. No announcement, no farewell email, just a quiet update buried in the next HOA newsletter. Residents began asking questions, real ones, about finances, about authority, about how far the board had been willing to go without verifying ownership. Trust eroded fast once people realized how close they'd come to being complicit in something illegal. As for the ranch, it never changed. The fences stayed where they had always been. The land remained quiet. But stepping onto it after everything that happened felt different, heavier, not because it was damaged, but because I finally understood how easily something inherited, something deeply personal, could be taken if no one pushed back. I moved in shortly after. Not out of defiance, out of closure. Being there mattered. Walking the land. Opening the gates myself. Making my presence known, not to the HOA, but to the history of the place. The phone calls stopped. The letters never came. No one questioned ownership again. And maybe the most important part of all this wasn't that the ranch was saved. It was that a line had been drawn. HOAs have authority, but only where the law allows it. Community doesn't mean ownership, and inheritance doesn't expire just because someone else decides they want what you have. That ranch wasn't protected by shouting. It wasn't protected by threats. It was protected by facts, patience, and the refusal to let someone else rewrite reality. Because once you let someone sell what isn't theirs, there's no telling what they'll try to take next.